Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Community Action for Climate Change, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Smart Growth Network and Island Press. My name is Jill Lemke, and I serve as the Manager of Planning Engagement at the Maryland Department of Planning. I also serve as a member of the Smart Growth Network Steering Committee. The Smart Growth Network is a national alliance of advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and local leaders working towards a shared vision for land use and infrastructure policies and actions that result in healthy, equitable, sustainable, and prosperous communities for all. In addition to hosting webinars, we provide information on effective planning, development, and preservation practices. The Smart Growth Network website is currently undergoing a transition. Please stay tuned for updates. Today's webinar is one in a series of webinars hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on sustainable growth and planning related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov or by visiting our YouTube channel. Our website also provides valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, tools, and educational opportunities, including information on future webinars. We also encourage you to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs. It is important to note that the views expressed by the speakers are those of the speakers and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the state of Maryland, or the Smart Growth Network. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To receive your credits, please visit the APA's website, planning.org, to log into your account and search for the name of today's event. You can also search for event number 9294916. Following the presentation, we will address as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time by opening the Q&A tool in the Zoom control panel. Now I am pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Kate Mangoya-Lafortune is a people-centered climate adaptation planner, community organizer, educator, parent, and cautious optimist. She is also the author of Climate Action for Busy People, a recently published book by Island Press. Raised in an environmental justice neighborhood, she is committed to furthering a future where all people live in clean, thriving communities. She received a BA in biology from Reed College, a Master of Science in Education from CUNY Layman, and a Master of City Planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She currently serves as the Chief Officer of Climate Resilience and Land Use at Groundwork USA. She lives with her family and community in New England. Mara Parker is a member of the Montgomery County Planning Division, where she serves as the Climate Adaptation Program Manager and coordinates climate adaptation and resilience programs for the Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security in Montgomery County, Maryland. As a member of the county's climate leadership team, she works with partner agencies to track progress on the county's climate action plan. She manages Resiliency Hub efforts as well as climate resilience community outreach. Mara leads the county's nonprofit security grant program and supports other planning division initiatives. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Kate, who will kick off the presentations. Welcome, Kate, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you so much to everyone who's joining us. My name's Kate, and I'm excited to be here to chat with you. And if you are anything like me, over the past month or so, you've been receiving a lot of notifications on your phone about weather advisories, either hurricanes that are coming through or heat advisories. Where I live in Boston, we've had about 4 or 5 heat waves, which is a little bit unusual for a city that's more associated with blizzards than blistering heat. And across the globe, as this is shaping up to be, again, the hottest decade on record, the consequences are pretty frightening sounding. Everything from retreating ice sheets to polar bears drowning as they try to swim 9 miles between ice flows, to entire populations of species like snow crabs collapsing because of rising water temperatures. A little bit closer to home in urban environments, we're also seeing the consequences in a slightly different way than is talked about in the common popular discourse around the climate crisis. Everything from basements being flooded due to extreme precipitation events to the sky turning pink and orange as it's covered in wildfire smoke that blows over from the West Coast, to summers that are so hot they're literally melting transportation infrastructure. That's, if anyone is familiar with Portland, Oregon's the Max. That's a couple years ago. The Max line is literally melting. And if you are having a sense of what I call the climate bubble guts, which is this churning anxiety about our future, then I think that's really normal. You're paying enough attention, and it is something to be anxious about. I am an elder millennial, which means that I have gone through, especially over the last 20 years, a variety of iterations of hearing about how we can intervene and work as individuals to help our environment. Everything from making sure that you pick up your trash to recycling to cutting the lids or those little rings around soda cans to reducing your individual carbon footprint. But all of these feel really disconnected from the extreme weather events that we have and that we experience. And this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, which just came out this June, Climate Action for Busy People. And this book is a guide to help anyone who is interested in helping to keep their community safe from the climate crisis, a roadmap or a guide to making small changes that can help to keep you safer from heat, from flood, from poor air quality, and wildfire smoke. And it's roughly broken down into three parts. The first explores why do things look the way that they do, because it's important to understand how we got there. The second breaks down small solutions that an individual or small group can do with a couple hours stolen from nights and weekends. And then the final piece is how do you organize for long-term hyper-local change at your municipal level. And I like to start a lot of the presentations that I do off with this picture. It's of the Lower Price Hill neighborhood in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I want to ask that if you were hanging out here on a really hot summer day, where in this picture would you want to be outside? If you're anything like me, you want to be on the left-hand side of this dotted line. There you see a dense and thriving tree canopy cover that's going to provide shade and cool the neighborhood. There's grass to soak up rainwater if it does storm. There's even a little swimming pool in someone's backyard. But on the other side of this dotted line, which I can't emphasize enough to you is literally on the same block, the picture is a lot different. There's not as much tree canopy cover. The trees that do exist are small. Maybe they're desiccated or dead. There's a tremendous amount of rooftop and pavement that's going to absorb the sun's rays and then slowly release it over the night, making the right side of this picture hotter day and night from the left-hand side of this picture. Additionally, with all of this impermeable pavement like roads and rooftops and concrete sidewalks, there's nowhere for water to go. So this side is more vulnerable to flooding from precipitation or from overflows of the Ohio River. If you were to go straight up from that picture into the atmosphere, you might run into the Landsat 7 and Landsat 8 satellites that NASA has put into orbit to take pictures of ground cover. And from that data, you would be able to look at something like tree canopy cover. This is an image of Cincinnati, and the area we were just looking at in that photo is outlined in black towards the bottom of the screen. It's the Lower Price Hill neighborhood. And the same relationship that we saw in that photograph, we see in this map of tree canopy cover, where the left-hand side has a lot more tree canopy cover than the right-hand side. And that has huge implications for how the communities in Cincinnati experience heat, with those areas that have denser tree canopy cover on the left being significantly cooler than those areas on the right that don't have tree canopy cover. Across the country, we are experiencing the climate crisis differently from state to state within our country, from city to city within a given state, and sometimes even neighborhood to neighborhood, or as you saw in the picture earlier, block to block within the same neighborhood. We're all experiencing it differently. If you go down to New Orleans, Louisiana, some of you might be familiar with the Claiborne Avenue Park and the history of that park. Back in the early 1900s, this area in Tremé had a beautiful linear park that ran through an upper class and upper middle class Black neighborhood that had thriving businesses and families who would promenade up and down this linear park underneath the shade of these 100-year-old live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. It was a place of recreation. It was a place that soaked up rainwater when it fell and provided important shade to the community. But in the 1950s, with the expansion of the federal highway system, the Claiborne Avenue area was chosen as the site of the latest highway that would run through Treme. So not only the park, but all of the homes surrounding it were completely razed to the ground. And so if you look at the linear park in 1942, this is what it would have looked like. Fast forward to 2016, and actually to today, this is what the exact same area looks like. With a lack of trees, that area is pretty hot, and all of this extra pavement is going to absorb the sun's rays and radiate it out, contributing to New Orleans' position as the #1 heat island in the country. Additionally, the lack of green spaces, trees, and grassy area means that when this neighborhood floods or receives a pretty significant, or not even very significant, even a short rain event, you can end up with pretty severe flooding that ends up in people's homes and makes it really dangerous to walk or drive. And if you look at things like air quality adjacent to the Claiborne Avenue Expressway, you're going to see exactly what you would expect, with higher rates of asthma and poorer air quality the closer you are to that Claiborne Avenue Expressway, which is a pretty big difference for the families that live there as compared to ones who lived there when the park was in place. So at this point, you might be pretty bummed. The book, my whole career, it's kind of marketed as being somewhat hopeful, and I'm showing up with what are some of the most depressing stories, I think, in the urban planning canon. But I promise that there's some good news. The good news is that in reality, we already know what to do to keep our communities safer from the climate crisis and to right some of the historical wrongs that have been put into place over the last few centuries. If you've ever walked down a tree-lined street, you know what it means to create a cooling corridor or a cool space. If you've ever sat by the cooling effects of a lake, or have seen rainwater sopped up by trees, you know that we understand the pieces of green infrastructure that need to appear across our city to keep people safer. We need to do things like block the sun with shade sails, with trees, with other interventions, and we need to find ways to bounce the heat back as to reduce the urban heat island effect. We need to create clear pathways for stormwater to get down into the sewer and increase the prevalence of green and open spaces to absorb that rainwater so that it stays out of homes and basements. Do you remember the picture that I showed you at the top of Cincinnati? This is the high school that was sort of in the mid-ground. And Groundwork Ohio River Valley, through their job training program in the Lower Price Hill neighborhood in Cincinnati, has built a really beautiful green roof on top of the Euler High School. This is going to help reduce the impact of the urban heat island effect by bouncing some of the sun's rays off of the roof. It's going to absorb storm waters and reduce utility costs for the high school. In New Orleans, there's plenty of opportunity to do things like install bioswales, rain gardens, and permeable pavement in the public right of way to help manage stormwater. And just a quick note, this neighborhood in New Orleans, when I was walking through it, I was really surprised to see that there actually are no storm drains. So in some of our cities, we need to be really dependent upon creative solutions for absorbing this stormwater when there isn't an opportunity to get it into the sewers. Another place that I work, in Elizabeth, New Jersey, in formerly redlined neighborhoods like the Elizabethport neighborhood, they have a lot of flood risk, both from the Atlantic Ocean coming up during storm surges and from the Elizabeth River overflowing. And Elizabeth, like many other cities, especially in the Northeast corridor, struggle with finding green and open spaces, or vacant spaces, to turn into green or open spaces. So Groundwork Elizabeth, working with the city of Elizabeth and a large group of residents, have taken over brownfields, or contaminated parcels of land, to turn them into microforests. And microforests use a combination of trees, shrubs, and ground cover to get the effects of a fully grown 50-year-old forest of the same size in as little as 5 years. So there's pretty significant impacts on cooling, on stormwater retention, and on air quality, and a great way to use underutilized parcels in one city. And you remember those really depressing pictures that I showed you of the Claiborne Avenue Expressway? This is underneath a similar spot to those overhead or aerial photos that I showed you. Vision to Reality Park is just finishing being built beneath, where Groundwork New Orleans, a number of residents came together to re-envision what the space underneath the expressway would look like. Here, there are fully grown trees that are casting shade. There's the installation of shade structures that have solar panels on top, so people can charge their phone and apply for FEMA benefits when there is a hurricane or a rainstorm that comes through and they're lacking access to power to be able to contact relatives or fill out applications or do the things that they need to do. And I love the picture of the kids in the lower hand side, because think of how different this area looks from when their parents were their age. And these kids get to enjoy this clean, healthy, green new space. And it's almost hard to see the expressway back there, but it's behind that little purple circle. So you might be saying, hey, Kate, either I'm a planner or I'm just a person, doing my best to make rent and do my laundry and stay hydrated. What can I possibly do? I think one of the most important things that we can all do is to recognize that there is no 100% solution to the climate crisis. And the best that we're going to be able to do is to pull together enough small, hyperlocal 1% solutions around adaptation that are people-centered to help keep all of us safer from the climate crisis. So there's a variety of things you can do. One of the things that I mentioned regarding flood risk is that there's sometimes a lot of obstructions between water going from the streets and from the sidewalks to getting into our sewer systems. So doing things like reporting poorly maintained drains or just using a stick or a shoe to kick dirt and debris and leaves out of a drain helps to create a clear pathway for the water to go into the sewer system. If you're someone who's in a position of policy making power or program making power at a city, you can also think about different ways to engage residents in creative stewardship of the existing infrastructure. So there's a number of cities across the country, everywhere from Berkeley to Boston, that are launching Adopt a Drain programs where residents can sign up to care for the drains near their homes or workplaces or businesses. They're usually provided things like shovels or gardening gloves to help clear the debris and garbage out. One of the things I love is that sometimes cities give residents the ability to name those sewers. You get funny stuff like Shania Drain, Alexander the Great, and Drain the Rock Johnson. Also a great opportunity to draw people's attention to this infrastructure that sometimes goes unnoticed by painting pictures or creating art around those drains. If you have access at your home or at your business to capturing stormwater, that's a great way to slow the flow of that water into the sewer system and help to keep it away from your basement. And one of my favorite interventions is either encouraging or creating opportunities or participating in opportunities to pull up excess pavements. We have a whole lot of pavement in a lot of places that we don't necessarily need it in our cities. There are groups. If you have a chance, go to depave.org and you can learn a little bit more about depaving parties. They are basically where a group of volunteer, no real experience necessary, comes together to remove pavement from areas that don't necessarily need to be paved. This photo on the right is from a depaving party that was held in my neighborhood for a neighbor who wanted to use that to do container gardening for our local mutual aid society. So folks come together with crowbars and hard hats. Someone comes with a guitar to strum pop covers. Somebody brings pizza or other snacks. And it's a great opportunity for residents to contribute to reducing the urban heat island effect and flood vulnerability in your neighborhood. Also, it's been a really hot, dry summer in parts of the country, and life is hard for an urban tree as compared to forests where trees have the benefit of connecting root systems and fungus and spaces and opportunity for their roots to go deeper to collect water. It can be kind of tough for a tree to stay alive. So even doing something as simple as keeping an old gallon milk jug by your door and filling it with water and watering the tree closest to your house on your way to work can go a long way towards preserving infrastructure. Cities across the country are looking to rely more on residents and to pull residents more intentionally into the process of caring for trees, which are a type of infrastructure, the same as a bridge or a storm drain might be, by creating tree adoption programs. And so if you're in a position to start one of these, I highly encourage you looking into it. Residents basically sign up to adopt a tree and are given information about how to care for it, how to report maintenance issues, when to water it, when to leave it alone. And it's a great way to have people connect a little bit more closely to the infrastructure in their neighborhood. Finally, I think one of the most important things any of us can do as individuals is getting to know your neighbors. The time to get to know who lives on your block is not in the middle of a crisis, it's right now. So that when a heat wave comes along, you know to check in on 80-year-old Mary across the street. Or when there's a flood, you might know that you can borrow a sump pump from your neighbor Eileen down the block. So it's really important to have that sense of togetherness and community cohesiveness to keep ourselves safe from the climate crisis. If you want to learn more about those individual or group solutions, a little bit more about how to organize for change at the municipal level, I encourage you to get a hold of Climate Action for Busy People, which is a pretty quick read and guides folks through how to enact these and many more changes to keep your communities safer from the advancing climate crisis. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to pass it over now to Mara.
Thank you so much, Kate. And let me just very quickly. Share my screen, and oh, somehow I am not seeing that option. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Bear with me just a moment. Okay. And let's start. All right. Um, so I just want to thank Kate so much, both for her presentation, but also for a book that I cannot recommend highly enough to everyone. It's an excellent read. It is a quick read, but as someone who's worked in and out of this field for a number of years, we all have those moments of darkness, and I found it such an inspiring read, and very optimistic. So I appreciated a lot of I came away with a lot of takeaways that I'm hoping to implement in my work. Um, I did want to just clarify. So I work in the Montgomery County, Maryland's Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security within their planning division. So not planning in the sense that most of those participating in this webinar today are planning. And hats off to you for the work that you do, but planning within the emergency management and climate change world. So I'm going to move into the presentation real quick. Often people wonder who invited the emergency management folks to the room. Why are we a part of climate discussion? And I equate this to, our Titanic moving towards that iceberg. Even if we all do all of the things right, we already know that we're seeing change and will continue to see change. And it's really a kind of a dereliction of duties if we don't do what we can to make sure everyone is able to survive the impacts of the change we're already seeing. To talk about this really briefly, disasters in this country are really raising at a rather alarming rate. In the previous 4 years, it was the fourth straight year with 18 or more billion-dollar disaster events in the United States. And the CPI adjusted average from 1980 to 2023 was 8.5 events per year. The annual average for the most recent 5-year period was 20.4. So I point this out because I think also for those of you in the audience who are working in jurisdictions where trying to use a discussion of climate as a driver for change is not politically feasible. And I really recognize that that can be the case, that using disasters as they are and the cost of those disasters to our communities can be another way to format the discussion in a productive way that can allow you to implement some of the changes we may be interested in seeing. I will add on a personal note that I've lived in Montgomery County, Maryland. For those who aren't familiar, is part of the suburban Maryland. In other words, we're part of the northern suburbs of Washington, D.C. It's a jurisdiction of about 1 million people, real mix of urban, suburban, and then we have the benefit of an agricultural reserve, which we can talk about a little bit later, but that's a tremendous asset that turns out to be phenomenal when we look toward climate change impacts. But I'm originally from the West Coast. I was born in Washington State and grew up largely in Alaska. So I definitely know feel the difference. In fact, I'm in Washington State right now with my parents in the Columbia River Valley, looking at smoke from one of the fires burning in the Stehekin area. So I know some of the impacts out west I'm very familiar with as well, and also very sympathetic to those who are in areas that are not as amenable to discussing some of the changes that we're seeing climate related. So going to heat, I wanted to touch on this after Kate's description, because what she's experiencing, many of us are experiencing all over the country in different ways. In Montgomery County, we just had a 4-day stretch in June of more than 100-degree weather, real temperature. And so, of course, we were talking about 110, 115 feels like. Heat is the number one deadliest weather-related disaster in the country. And that's hands down. In fact, if you combine the next 4 weather-related disasters, heat beats all four of them. So it's something that we need to be very cognizant of. People feel it so intensely at a personal level, no matter what their economic circumstances. They feel it also with the funding that they have to pay to keep their homes cool, if they have that option. Heat exacerbates the effects of all those chronic diseases that Kate touched on. So a lot of folks don't realize that for those who aren't able to cool down during the day, those who are working in landscaping and construction, if they don't have an opportunity to lower their core body temperature in the evening through the use of air conditioning, the chance of having significant health impacts, including fatality for them, is significantly raised. And it also has an impact on other chronic conditions like asthma. So heat is a really important consideration for us to have, and it is not felt equitably for all of those reasons Kate just pointed out, specifically related to tree cover and impervious surface and the impact that has. So how can we ensure that everyone survives and thrives the circumstances that we're increasingly seeing the impacts of climate change? Montgomery County's main risks are flooding, flash flooding predominantly where we're located, urban heat island effect and heat waves, and drought. We've experienced 2 out of those 3 pretty profoundly already this summer, and we had some pretty significant flooding incidents happen in January as well. So we are feeling them very profoundly, and we're doing a number of things to try to be ahead of the game a little bit and use data. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk about as we look at how you all as practitioners at the local level, where that change can be the most profound, but also can sometimes be challenging to push those needles, that there are different ways you can get at this and different ways you can help keep people safe and ensure, particularly with an eye to equity, that everyone is you don't have a disproportionate impact felt by communities that have the least ability to adapt to it. So I'm going to talk about flood risk. This is Montgomery County, and if you look down here, you see this little point right here is the top of Washington, D.C. So you can see that our county hugs DC here and has a very densely populated urban area here and suburban up these corridors, and then an agricultural reserve of protected land and a bit of a horseshoe here. We received funding through the Department of Homeland Security a few years ago to participate in a flood sensor pilot program, and it enabled us to add flood sensors to 35 of our most frequently flooded roadways and streams throughout the county. And flood sensors are great for those who have that as a risk, with climate-related risk. People understand flooding. The implications to public safety are profound. And insofar as we can get advance warning, and we've now used these flood sensors in our emergency operations center in real time, we're able to look and see that we can see that a stream, one of our sensors up here has reached flood stage or is close to flood stage. And as we get more and more data related to this, we can tell that we know what the implication is downstream, and we can start closing roadways that will keep people from being washed away, prevent people from driving across a street that we know is going to be at elevated risk. So using data to guide our flood risk has been one thing we're doing to improve public safety. And of course, there are implications as well for households that get flooded, but we'll come back to that. Community heat mapping. And some of these I want to talk about the resources that we use to do these. I'm very cognizant of the fact that I'm coming from a jurisdiction that is pretty fortunate in terms of its location and proximity to Washington, D.C., that we have a more ready access to resources at FEMA. We also are, quite frankly, a county that has more funding than a lot do and more staff than many places. We have an emergency management department with about 17 people. The jurisdiction where I am right now in Eastern Washington State, sometimes they have one person who works for the fire department half-time doing their emergency management. So what's important is to look at where can we utilize resources and funding from other places. So that's where I'm going to be focusing some of my discussion on today. So the community heat mapping, we're trying to, again, use data, and we applied for and received a grant from NOAA with CAPA Strategies. They did a citizen science project, which is a really wonderful way to engage members of the communities who are most impacted by heat. And 2 years ago, in August of 2022, we picked a day, and we had heat sensors that were able to attach to cars, and drove on prescribed routes all around Montgomery County, Maryland, with volunteers, and took measurements morning, midday, and in the evening of heat. And the differences, as you can imagine, and as Kate so aptly described, some places the difference between one neighborhood and the next could be up to 20, 25 degrees hotter in some of our most intense urban heat island effect places. But having that data to help drive how our resources are used, but also having that data to apply for federal and state funding for projects can be really helpful. So that is a way in which I encourage you to work within your jurisdictions to think about those opportunities. We've also been really fortunate to have a lot of college interns, and this is one I would encourage people to tap those resources, who have helped us further take maps like this one, our climate justice and equity map. And it's an interactive map, and I'll include a link to it at the end of my presentation, that includes data used from the Justice 40 track from the EPA, the U.S. Census Bureau's social vulnerability indices, the Maryland, the National Capital Council of Governments, and then the National Capital Park and Planning's equity emphasis areas. And that is, again, extremely helpful for us when we're applying for grants for a lot of the projects we want to do to address these issues. When we have that data and we can clearly show that we are proposing putting a resilience hub, which we'll talk about in a minute, in this location, and we can show that that location is in an equity emphasis area and a social vulnerability and a Justice 40, it increases our chances and helps us make that argument and that story. I'm going to talk about some of the other funding options, but I will mention that we're currently working with the grant from the American Geophysical Union through a project they call the Thriving Earth Exchange. This is a fantastic opportunity for jurisdictions to get absolute expert level assistance for free from geophysicists all over the country, both working and retired, who basically you propose a project to them and they will come help you figure out that project, whether it's research or data or coming up with a solution to the problem. It's another great useful tool. So briefly, this is my Houston, we have a problem, and that's literally a picture of Houston from earlier this year. You'll recall that they had a powerful windstorm. We've had a derecho come through Maryland as well a few years ago in the summer, followed by, so it takes out a big chunk of the electrical grid, and then it's followed by a heat wave where you have people at tremendous risk. And so one of the things for all of you as planners to think about in the facilities and plans that are being developed in your jurisdictions are some of the facilities being constructed critical infrastructure? How would that construction perform if the grid in that community goes down? Whether, and again, this is speaking towards folks who have a challenge in making the climate argument, that grid could go down because it's overtaxed. It could go down from a storm, or it could even be hacked by a bad actor. So there are other ways that you can get at funding and support for this type of work that maybe don't involve the word climate change, if it's a term that you can't use. Is your jurisdiction in an area with a history of grid instability, and do climate models predict that it's going to get worse? Can you think about building more resilient facilities that include microgrids with battery backups to provide uninterrupted service during utility disruptions? What about green infrastructure? If the facility has public-facing services, think about a resilience hub, and let's talk about what that might be. So resilience hubs, and I want to give a shout out right now to the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which has really done the lion's share of work on what a resilience hub is. They have, and I'll include a link to their information later, but don't reinvent the wheel on any of this stuff. They have phenomenal resources, including guides on, operational manuals that you can utilize. So shout out to them. And a lot of this information comes from them. So what is a resilience hub? It is a community serving facility that is augmented to support residents, coordinate communication, distribute resources, and reduce carbon pollution while it enhances quality of life. It can meet a myriad of physical and social goals by using a trusted physical space. It might be a community center or a recreation facility, but it might also be a faith-based facility or multifamily housing building that has surrounding infrastructure like a community park or a vacant lot or an active community garden. So resilience hubs are designed to have three different modes of function. So the everyday mode is it is already a community center of some sort. People go there, there's after school programming there. So again, recreation centers are the ones that we often think of in local government. And people know that it's a place they know and trust already. So if there is then a disruption, a resilience hub is the natural place for people to go to. And if you've built it out as a resilience hub, you're going to add a solar microgrid with a battery backup sufficient to power that building so that people could come there to cool off in an emergency, charge their, not just their electronic devices, but think about medical devices that people could charge. They could store medications if they have medications that require refrigeration, or even if you had mothers who were pumping milk for their children and needed to store it. So these are ways in which the community could use that space until the grid came up. And then during the recovery from a disaster, they would be able to continue using that space. So the 5 foundational areas of resilience hubs relate to the services and programs I already discussed, the communication and trust with the community. And as far as planning folks are concerned, obviously, we have the building itself. Ultimately, that building is one that you want to harden to survive the assault of whether it was a high wind event or rain. You don't want something in a floodplain, clearly. And putting in reliable backup and electrifying that building and enabling it to continue functioning, even if the grid were to go down. And there's the operational side as well. Clearly, you need to do that in concert with the people who would be running that building. So in our community, we are just beginning to build out resilience hubs. I'm going to talk very briefly about our first hub, which is at the Scotland Community Resource Hub or Resilience Hub. Scotland is a historic African-American community that was established in the late 1800s by William Dove, who was a formerly enslaved resident, purchased 200 acres of land at auction. And it became at one point a very robust African-American community, over 500 acres. But now, through a lot of those unfortunate factors that were discussed earlier by Kate, it has been whittled down to just 11 acres. It's an enclave of working tax-paying citizens, but there were points right up until the 1950s and 60s where there was no running water, sewer systems, garbage service, or paved roads. And yet, that community is located in Potomac, Maryland, which for anyone who's familiar with the area, Potomac, I always say, is where the 0.001% are living in many cases. It's a sea of a robust African-American community, very tight-knit group of generations, but it's surrounded by an island of wealth. But they were often very much disenfranchised, and there were many people who came and effectively conned folks out of their land over the course of the years. So we used a lot of the data about heat and social vulnerability to place our first resilience hub there. We received funding for it from the Maryland Energy Administration's Resilient Maryland program. There will be a link to that later on and at the end of this. And we put in a microgrid with battery backup. It's sufficient to power a community room, a kitchen, charging ports for the community. And that community center is a well-loved resource. So I want to talk as I'm wrapping things up, about some of the small changes, following along with what Kate said. What are the real manageable things that you can do, particularly if you're in a jurisdiction where there isn't a lot of political support or there just isn't a lot of funding? So first, I would encourage folks to create a climate team within your jurisdiction, outside of your department. Meet regularly, plan and coordinate, using outreach. Be a force multiplier for each other. Don't forget to include things that you might think are outside your box, like your health programs. Often health programs are a real place of trust for people with government, just as schools can be. Look at how the planning decisions that you are all making and recommending relate to green infrastructure and mitigation strategies. Use an equity lens to consider what the long-term impacts of projects are for the communities who are often at that losing end of the justice system. Map out your jurisdiction's resources and make sure you include community resources. Think about climate interns, free labor. A lot of the GIS work and mapping that we have in the county was done by interns who we were delighted to give them a work opportunity, and they gave us tremendous work product. Emergency planning, outreach to higher risk communities does not have to be expensive, and doing that through nonprofit and faith-based organizations who have relationships of trust can be a really great way to do that. Use your local volunteer fire departments, your CERT and COAD, medical reserve corps, and schools. Don't forget trees. Look at partnering with schools to involve young people as volunteer stewards for trees and storm drains, as Kate outlined. And don't forget to bring seniors into the mix. Finally, I wanted to talk about translating materials into other languages, because a lot of our most vulnerable communities are those who are low English proficiency. And this is a challenge in emergency management, not going to lie, and we're still working on it. But when you can include emergency alerts and social media graphics in multiple languages, or at least the most commonly used language aside from English in your jurisdiction, please do that. And I would encourage you to, again, don't reinvent the wheel. Both FEMA and NOAA and the National Weather Service have really fantastic graphics that we utilize all the time. We'll just post the same message with both images. And they also have social media campaigns in both English and Spanish, and sometimes other languages. I'll include those links at the end. Use those resources. So these are some of the resources that I would encourage you to look into. And this will be available to everyone at the end of the discussion. I'll just close by saying that I would encourage you to do a few things. Just don't forget that simple upgrades to your energy systems, if you're upgrading lighting systems, including double pane windows that might be resistant to winds, building out your infrastructure so that if you're in an area that doesn't have the political will to put solar there now, you're in a good position to do it later. Sit down with your permitting, emergency management, building services departments. Talk about what codes may be blocking access to solar or heat pumps in your community. What about landscaping for drought in mind? Are there codes in place now that make that hard to do? These are things that can be changed without a significant investment of money. And I definitely encourage people to think about those as well. I'm going to stop now because I'm pretty sure I'm over time, but I look forward to a robust discussion, and thank you all. I'm going to turn it over to Jill now and stop sharing.
Thank you, Mara. Great presentations. I really appreciate all of your words of advice and wisdom. Throughout the presentation, we've been assembling questions from the audience. Please continue to submit questions throughout the discussion, and we'll get to as many as we can until 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If our speakers would turn on their cameras, we'll get started. Let's see. So I guess this is a question for both of you. It's a bit general, but I think you guys can come up with some good recommendations, perhaps that weren't already in your presentations. What do local municipalities who are implementing authorities typically need to move forward on resiliency strategies? What are some of the top things that people should look for or do?
I can kick
Want
part
to
of it
start,
off.
Kate?
I think that in any sort of climate resiliency strategy, we need to think about what we're doing it for, and a lot of times it's for people, and so figuring out how to develop into the planning process or into the development of a resiliency plan, the lived experience and needs of people who are most impacted by the climate crisis in your community, and that can look in a couple different ways. That can look like paying residents for their expertise in the planning process and considering them to have a level of expertise that's on par with, say, a hydrologist or someone in the planning department, because no one really knows their neighborhood as well as people who live in that space. I think also looking towards resilience plans that not only make a change in the short term, but also include a forward-looking lens. How are we going to maintain the infrastructure that we put in? Are there dollars for that? How are we going to continue to fund any sort of improvements or upgrades over the next 5, 10, 15 years? So keeping an eye towards that. And then also trying to identify what are the opportunities to pet multiple cats with one hand with a resilience plan. So when we think about something like extreme heat, it's not just an issue for folks in their homes. It's also an issue for people who are commuting, for workers who are working outside, for seniors who might not be able to get to know their neighbors because it's just too hot outside. So it's a sort of a socialization and a quality of life issue. And that allows you to build a really big umbrella of stakeholders at the table who might be looking at a resiliency issue from a different lens, but have a lot to contribute and might also be able to contribute their time, expertise, or importantly, their resources towards the implementation of some of those plans. So, someone like your Council on Aging or your state departments of recreation might have an interest in the way in which you're building out a plan at the local level. Or I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you talking about involving folks who are in these communities in the decision-making process. I know in planning, there's this concept of charrettes, which I think are really important, but I think it's also important to, meet people where they are. I always tell people coming out of COVID, we learned a lot of lessons. And although it was obviously a tremendous tragedy, there were some incredible relationships built, and we really found coming out of that circumstance, we had done, for example, some work working with our health programs, which I mentioned, and also nonprofit providers, the faith-based providers in the community who were doing food distributions. And then we ended up also doing testing, and then we were distributing PPE. And it really started to build on existing relationships, but it was a way for government to be involved with nonprofits. We developed some hubs actually around the county. They're not specifically resilience hubs, although we're hoping to make some of them resilience hubs. Many of them, as I mentioned, are at faith-based facilities. For some of our communities, there is more of a relationship of trust. Could be with their church or their synagogue or their mosque. We have a very active mosque in our community that has a health center that gets funding from the county and the state in it. So we already have this natural community resource. They did food distributions, they did vaccinations during COVID. So building on those existing resources, meeting people there and involving them in the process and listening, because many of our communities who are most heavily impacted, and I'm thinking particularly of some of our immigrant communities, ironically, they're already doing a lot of the things that we want other people to do. They're already gardening in their backyard. They're already reusing things. They're already using public transit. So first of all, an acknowledgement that they're already a part of the solution is important. and that they have something to teach the rest of us. So don't forget them in that equation. Really listen and value to the things that they want in their community, that they need, how they reach people. I've often said translation is a big issue. We now have a language access plan in our county that we're all working to implement in our 6 most commonly spoken languages. But we know in COVID, as we were desperately trying to translate things into all our languages, we had a really wonderful person in our Department of technology services who went through and looked how many people were actually accessing the information we translated so painstakingly. And we can tell you, for example, that within the Vietnamese speaking community, which had a lot of higher risk elderly people in that community, we had almost 0 hits. So it's not enough to just, in those cases, translate that information. You need to figure out, how do you actually reach those people? And it may be through a completely different way. It may be through community groups. It may be through, gathering places. Some communities, it's your barbershop. What are the different places that people meet and get information, and how can you form a relationship with the folks who are their kind of amplifiers? But from a government standpoint, it's often hard to do that. Sometimes we want to do everything. We want to do everything top down. We have this prescribed way we want to do it. We're just going to put that little cookie cutter everywhere. But it's like I said, you could put solar on a building, but the question is, if you build it, will they come? If you don't put it on the right building, and in some communities, we don't have a government building that meets that need. So don't be afraid to reach out to your nonprofit partners and see how you can help them with grant writing, because that's sometimes the biggest hindrance. They may be a great partner, but they may have a challenge in trying to justify it. So use the data that you have, share that data with nonprofit partners so that they can then use it to make their case to get funding that meets a need you already have in your community. And I apologize, I had to get up and let a very anxious dog in. So sorry.
That's okay. We all have those issues. I wanted to ask, a lot of our viewers and people who sign into our webinars come from smaller rural areas that notoriously do not have access to resources such that those of us in the greater Washington, D.C. region have access to. So we have relatively easy access to federal agencies and the people who work for them. Do you have any advice or specific examples that might be particularly valuable for those types of communities that are rural or lacking in resources to even do smaller interventions?
I think that where a lot of the anxiety comes from around the climate crisis is from this perception of scarcity. And in some cases, it's very real, right? There's federal dollars that are not flowing to local areas. There might be states that are holding up dollars from going to the local level, or there might be a distribution that's just not equitable for a variety of reasons. But I think it's important to rethink what the resources are at your disposal. And there's actually a lot of abundance in the people and institutions that already exist. So Samara mentioned some of them, like faith-based institutions or cultural or heritage-based institutions, but also in the residents who live there, who are both very invested in their home and in their community, and also bring a variety of different types of resources, like their relationships, their creativity, their historical knowledge of place and space. And you can put a lot of that to work to implement small solutions that are either in communal spaces or in people's homes. Ones that I think of are I had sort of mentioned things like, sort of pulling up pavement in spaces. And I think that community gathering spaces like churches or community centers, or even things like sort of shopping centers, have and do need a pretty high degree of parking. But what does it look like to put in, potentially green space requirements around some of these areas, or to help to work with a faith-based institution to increase the amount of green infrastructure on their property to capture that stormwater? This is not in a rural location, but one of the places that we worked with in Richmond, Virginia, there's a church there who's sort of on the outskirts of the city that has a pretty sizable plot of land. And they were really struggling with flooding inside of their church. They were really struggling in being able to maintain this community space. So Grandmark Richmond in Richmond, Virginia, worked with them to do things like installing rain barrels or developing a community gardening space to be able to harvest and utilize that rainwater and divert it away from the building. So I think tapping into what are the social needs of the community, who are the people whose energy, ideas, time, expertise, labor you can tap into to help sort of improve their community can be helpful. Do we still need to change the distribution of resources so it's more equitable? Like, absolutely. But until we get to that point, I think there is a shift that we can make to rethink the resources that we do have at our disposal and try to figure out where is that abundance that we might not be tapping into and might not be recognizing.
Yeah, and I think along that line too, remember to look at some of the things like the Justice 40 information, because you may be very surprised to find that your rural area is a priority area. And there are a lot of programs with federal dollars where they are really doing a pivot, and they're looking far more intentionally. They designate a certain amount of funding. What I would say is a couple things to consider, especially with federal dollars. Make sure you're talking with your emergency managers. You need to have a hazard mitigation plan in place in order to apply for a lot of the money that's available. And that can be a challenging thing to do. There are lots of workshops that are available and free to walk you through that process. But definitely ask that question: do we have a hazard mitigation plan? If we don't have one, what are the steps we need to do to get there? Because it will open up a lot of funding opportunities for you. I included at the end of my presentation links to a couple of different resources, including like BRIC grants, which is building resiliency and infrastructure. Those I say that, but even for us, those applications can be pretty onerous. So you have to plan very far ahead of time. You have to know what you're into. So in many cases, you need to first propose a project to your state. Your state has to approve. Yes, we think that's a worthy project for that federal money, which we're going to then pass on. Then you put the project together. You have to have a budget. An assessment, which is a little challenging to do. So you need to give yourself a whole lot of leeway and participate in some of the workshops they offer so that you learn, what do I need to do to justify this project and how much leeway do I need? If you happen to be in the state of Maryland, I can tell you that the Resilient Maryland projects, we're anticipating probably around March of 2025 is when they're going to have the applications open for the next year. So start now, go on their website, find out what their requirements are, what are the different levels that they make available to you, and start putting together that justification now. You need to give yourself a long planning horizon, but also you need to involve other departments. Don't function as an island. You really do need to involve everyone else, both in your community, as Kate said, and within your government and jurisdictions, to make a really powerful case to get the funding that you deserve. As I said, my family lives in a part of Washington State that's on the Columbia River, and there are a number of dams in this area that are both a tremendous asset, but could be a huge risk. And I think there are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of things too that, as Kate said, in rural communities, people do know how to grow things. They know how to preserve things in a way that often that is lost in some of our urban communities, or they don't have a link to the land that is needed to do that. But that's a tremendous asset that people have in rural communities over folks sometimes in urban communities. And when you look at food insecurity, that's huge. So finding a way to pass that knowledge on from the elders in the community to a younger generation is also a really small example of something that you can do as well.
Great, thank you. One of the questions we have, well, a few questions, address sort of the tensions between doing little things, smaller interventions that make a small difference when you add up over time become big differences. One of the questions is, how do you prevent green gentrification, where improving climate resilience in green spaces may result in increased demand and value for that neighborhood, which could displace people who are currently living there?
I have a lot of opinions about green gentrification. I actually don't love the term because it puts the onus on the greening, on the trees, on the parks, for creating that displacement, as compared to the people who are disproportionately trying to capture what is usually public investment in a place and trying to capture the increased capital value for private ownership. And I think that's where a lot of our attention needs to look. Honestly, no one is forcing landlords to raise rent. Like, no one's twisting their arm behind their back and saying, gosh, there's a tree here, you got to raise raise this rent 25% overnight. But people are sort of making that choice to do it. And it's part of an accepted way of doing business in our culture, where the dominant method of building and maintaining and passing along intergenerational wealth is through property ownership. And I think that when we're looking at green infrastructure in especially communities that have high vulnerability or maybe have lacked this investment from cities and towns in the past, I think there's a couple of different angles that we can look at it. Some of the things that cause displacement might be, increasing rents. And I think there's an opportunity for folks who work in the maybe parks and recreation or in nonprofits to start pairing with people who do housing decommodification. So is there room at your local public housing authority or in for affordable housing to make investments in green spaces for community gardening, trees, areas that are going to enhance and improve the safety, but where there's no risk of people being displaced because the housing authority and the affordable housing are not going to raise the rent? Or does it make sense to look at building parks or green spaces on land that is in consultation with community land trusts or with land bank strategies, so that the community land trust can say, hey, we're building decommodified housing here, and also pairing it with some greening, and working with local land banks, if there is one in your community, to think about strategies of dispossession of that property that prioritize housing stabilization alongside the creation of green infrastructure. I think we're never going to crack the nut until we look into the ugly truth of the matter, which is we are making a policy choice right now to let folks disproportionately capture wealth from public investments, and that we might need to change the way that we do business around housing, around maybe rent stabilization or rent control, around zoning practices to allow more building of housing around green spaces, for example, to help depress some of that restriction on supply. So I think we're going to have to think really creatively and in consultation with folks who have been doing this work for a very, very long time. But in general, I don't really love the term green gentrification, as I mentioned, because it's not the trees' fault that rents are going up, and the people who live in communities without these resources deserve to have them as much as anybody else, especially if it's a public investment. Everybody should benefit from public investments. So I think that the TLDR, or the punchline of that, is that in building new green spaces, it's really important to connect with community. One quick story. I was living in New York. I'm originally from New York City and moved back after college to teach. I was a middle school science teacher in the South Bronx in East New York. And my first year back in the city, I was living on 135th Street between Broadway and Amsterdam. It was marketed as a Riverview apartment because if you shoved your face against the bars and looked to the left, you could see like the tiniest glint of the Hudson River in between the buildings. And there were no trees in the neighborhood. It was a mostly Dominican immigrant neighborhood. I lived in a fifth floor walk up. And when I went to work one morning, my street looked the way it always did. When I came home in the afternoon, there were trees that were planted about every 8 feet by the Bloomberg's Million Trees campaign. I went to bed for the night. I came out the next morning and I saw that every single tree on both sides of the street had been snapped off and thrown into the middle of the road. And there was this woman who was always in the first floor window. It could be like 2 in the morning or 8 at night. She was just always in that window. And I turned and asked her, I was like, what happened here? And she just said, they didn't ask us. And while on paper and using a data-driven approach, that block was the perfect spot for trees. There's a really wide sidewalk, so you still have ADA accessibility. There's no overhanging power lines, so you can plant full-size trees. There's heat and flood risk. This is like the picture perfect technocrat view of where to plant a tree. But for residents, it wasn't the case. It was, if we plant these trees here, is our landlord going to raise our rent? If we plant trees here, is it going to block the window box that I'm using to grow culturally complementary herbs that are important to a religious ceremony or to a holiday in my neighborhood? And I think most importantly, why is someone coming into our home, into our neighborhood, into our community and making changes without consulting us? So I think that, while you might also choose to, and I highly encourage this, partner with other institutions that are focused on housing, on zoning reform, on land decommodification, it's also really important to pull residents in from the ground floor so that they can sort of fully consent and engage in shared leadership and decision-making around the placement of those trees. There's someone who told me that when they were doing their sort of tree planning, they did consult with residents and found out that, they needed to have it not block the windows because there was a feng shui issue from a Chinese community that was living in this building, and consultation just allowed them to move it like a couple feet over to the left, and everybody was happy. So engaging in shared leadership and decision making with residents is one of the ways to address this very complicated and challenging problem.
Wow, what great examples. I can only imagine what a dynamic teacher you were. Um, so um, I would encourage a couple other things too when you're thinking about this is in local jurisdictions, looking at ways in which your jurisdiction can help tenants purchase their buildings. That's one way that you might be able to protect. Obviously, rent stabilization, that can be, for some jurisdictions, a harder pill to swallow. We've just recently started to get that in our county after many, many years of trying, and started with simple things like, just cause eviction, which I think is something people can understand, that you can't just evict someone for no reason. You have to have a justifiable reason for doing that. Sometimes you make small baby steps in that. Or perhaps when you as a planner are developing a new master plan for an area that you have new transit line coming through that has that potential to raise the property value and potentially force people out, is there something that you can build into that plan specifically for areas along that corridor to protect both the residential, but also the small businesses whose rent could also go up, and that could really force people out too. So those are some ideas. Looking at having a green bank, if you don't, have one, look into that, see if that's something that can help fund some of those improvements. One of the things as planners I would definitely encourage folks to think about is not allowing existing in place affordable housing in older buildings to be torn down in the name of progress. So this is something I have a little bit of a bee in my bonnet about, but here we are in the nation's capital where you have Congress and the White House, pretty old buildings, but you will have people use kind of demolition by neglect in these buildings where they allow them to deteriorate over time by not enforcing codes. And then new development comes in, or an opportunity to tear it down. And in the name of progress, or even in the name of building more affordable housing, which in jurisdictions like mine, it's pretty hard to rebuild in our area a building that is going to be affordable to the folks who are living there now. Not a moderately priced dwelling unit, which is not affordable to low-income folks, but the actual place they're living right now. Think about that. Think about that when you are doing your planning, and whether you can protect some of that in place, existing, naturally occurring affordable housing, because that's one way to also keep people in place as things change and evolve around them. And also from a planning standpoint, please look at forest conservation laws. Look at how, if you have, and I look at in Maryland and in Montgomery County and Prince George's County right now, we have the Purple Line corridor, which is a new light rail, which will connect some of the outer spokes of the metro system coming out of DC. It's a very exciting public transportation project. It cuts through many swaths of areas that are low income, folks who are already transit dependent. Unfortunately, a lot of trees have been taken out, and that's a challenging thing to see, because those communities are going to live without trees for 10. I mean, they've been living without trees for 10 years in some cases right now. Like, if we're being honest, that's how long it's going to be. And then it's going to take a long time for them to come back. But as we look at some of those areas, as plans allow you to come in and redevelop an area where they're going to take out some trees, does your forest conservation law allow the replanting somewhere else? It shouldn't. If you're doing development in a community and you remove trees, think about what you can do to require that the replacement trees be in the same community. That's been a big issue in our jurisdiction that we're trying, have been working at changing, but that's a consideration too, because trees are so important. And I always tell people, think deeper about trees. Not only, and that example that you gave too, we have stories, Laura, that are very similar to that, where you put trees in and they die, or people don't want them because you haven't involved them in the conversation. But involve the community, give a sense of ownership. Think about whether you can involve local school kids in doing a map of the trees or the lack thereof, the dead trees, the stumps in their neighborhood, helping them choose sites then for replanting of street trees, and have them adopt that tree and give them community service hours that many of them need for graduation. And then you've built these kind of tree stewards that could evolve into a job training program in arborists. There are a lot of opportunities there that you can kind of build on that to think about.
One thing that I really like that you brought up the tree conservation element, because baby trees take a really long time to become useful. They're like not particularly cute. They're not particularly helpful. There's a newish tree outside my apartment building that casts a shade that's about the size and shape of a pizza box. So it's not going to be doing anything for a long time. One other piece when you're thinking about your tree conservation ordinances is to also look at the list of trees that are projected to be appropriate for your region in that 10, 20, 30 years. About 2 years ago, the USDA Forest Service released a new list of what they think are going to be trees for good regions.
Yeah.
Or appropriate trees for the modeled changes that we're expected to see in terms of precipitation and heat. So not just, planting sort of what has always been good in your community, but thinking about diversification to make the urban forestry asset infrastructure that your community has more stable over time as well.
One other thing I want to add about trees. So think also and talk with your community about the carbon sequestering power of trees. One of the things that we've also noticed, not just in our higher needs areas, but even in some of our higher demand green lined neighborhoods, is they used to have tremendous forest canopy, right? But we're seeing now with infill development, a lot of tree loss in those areas as well, because we're building out to the edge of the land of the plot. Trees are removed and not replaced, and other trees are aging out and not being replaced. So there's a lot of opportunities to talk with all of your communities. And what people see too is then nuisance flooding as a result of a lot of that development. As you have more impervious surface, it causes flooding for another neighbor down the line. So there's a lot of opportunities there to talk with people about that. And the final one I'll say is about carbon sequestration in trees is our planning department, our park and planning department in Montgomery County actually purchased a small sawmill that they are now using. So if a park or a street tree goes down and it's a big, beautiful tree, instead of chipping it or God forbid burning it, you can actually take it and they can mill it into really high desirable wood. And they have a sale every year, which the stuff is gone in a minute. You've got this gorgeous live edge wood. They utilize wood and the mill for most of the furniture in their new offices and their lobby area. So there's some great opportunities there to talk with people about that, because when you create a piece of furniture out of a piece of wood, you're sequestering that carbon for decades, if not longer. And that's a great learning opportunity, I think.
Thank you. These are really great examples, and thank you for bringing in the notion of saving trees. We have an issue here in Baltimore, Maryland, where a lot of our mature trees and forested areas are being taken over by invasive vines, and the vines are killing these big, beautiful trees that took hundreds of years to grow. So there is an organization called Weed Warriors that's going out to try to save those trees and take the vines off of the trees in ways that will not harm the trees. So thank you for that, and also bringing in small businesses to the conversation. One of the questions that we have, there's been a couple of questions actually about where to get good data. So one question is, because of the changes in intensities of rainstorms, what is a good source for that type of data in terms of localized data for, recent past storms as well as projections? And then what kind of analysis or analyses are needed to determine the appropriate location and size for resilience hubs so that they are meeting the needs that are most urgent in individual communities?
Yeah, so one source, if you happen to be anywhere in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, the Chesapeake Bay Alliance and Foundation has a tremendous high resolution land use and land cover data that's publicly available and is being updated on a regular basis. I know it goes all the way up to parts of New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Virginia and Maryland. That's a phenomenal resource. I am now just thinking that I neglected to include it in my list of resources, so I will send something to follow up that hopefully can be passed on to folks, but I would highly recommend that. The the EPA's Justice 40 initiative, the Census Bureau's social vulnerability indices. That data is available at the zip code level. You can really drill down into neighborhoods and look at that type of data to help you drive your decisions. I know in our county, and I will say Baltimore, like hats off to Baltimore, because they are really leading on resilience hubs, and we're playing catch up. And I think it's important to acknowledge the work that's been done there. There's also some organizations, one that folks might want to look into called Groundswell, which is doing a lot of work on resilience hubs and helping jurisdictions, helping nonprofit partners and faith-based partners go through and kind of walk them through that process. So they're a good partner. They've come into the county and looked at a couple different locations in Montgomery County recently. We were able to help guide them and give them a letter of justification. We could explain by using publicly available census data that yes, this housing project that they were looking at with a community room that could be a resilience hub was walking distance to thousands of people who met all these different social vulnerability criteria, that it was an area that was within our worst urban heat island effect. So that data is, a lot of that data is public, and also tree cover data. So again, you can get that through Chesapeake Bay. I'm sure there's some other resources nationwide that I'm not as familiar with that many of you may know, but look into that and use that free data as much as possible, because there is really a lot of it out there.
We actually have the most data of any country. It is very unusual to have this amount of data that's collected around things like the National Land Cover Database. It's and I think that one of the things that's a little bit challenging, though, is that we've got this absolute glut of data that's available in the public right away. But what do you do with it if you're not a GIS practitioner or you're not a modeling practitioner? And Mara had alluded to this in her presentation already, that there's plenty of universities, which I think are kind of the best kept secret in terms of getting that data turned into something that's tangible and useful, not just for municipalities, but I actually think for regular folks that have questions about their community and are trying to organize for change. Universities can be really helpful. Where I work at Groundwork, we've done a lot of work with organizations like the Urban Systems Lab at the New School in New York, which is helping us across the country to do modeling utilizing that data. So the United States has a really unusual amount of free publicly available data. The other thing that I would also say is to turn towards community science as a way of filling in the gaps. One of the downsides about all of this data is that because it's only a 30 meter by 30 meter area at its highest resolution, I'm talking about the free data you can get a hold of, it can sometimes get rid of some of the localized nuance. So for example, in parts of the Hudson Valley in New York, if you look from a top down, from the land satellite perspective, it doesn't look like there's any flooding there. But a couple of years ago, some residents started to do like a hashtag for flooding to tag pictures in their neighborhood of where there was short-term localized flooding. So maybe the flood is not there long enough for the satellite to pass and capture a clear image of it, but it's enough to ruin the clothes that you've stored in the winter in your basement, or to make your drywall start to bloom mold, even if it's just a quick hit and it passes. So community science and talking to residents about where they're experiencing local flooding, engaging them in community science where they can capture and record data alongside either a member of the municipality or the member of a university to make sure that their methods are sort of within reason, is also a great way to capture some of that localized data that satellites sometimes miss.
Yeah. I would add too, we are in the process of installing in the state of Maryland a Mesonet system, which are weather stations that are done at a meso or a local scale. And they're all over the country. Oklahoma has had a Mesonet system for 30 years now. They're one of the original ones, which makes a little sense when you think that there are NASA facilities there and a lot of really compelling reasons that you want to get early warning about things coming at you in Oklahoma, right? So we're in the process of doing that, and it's done in concert with the University of Maryland. And often, just as Kate said, your local universities or your state universities are a tremendous source of information. We're using information, a dashboard, and I'm not sure if it's South Carolina or North Carolina, I think it's South Carolina, that has a flood sensor dashboard that we are modeling ours on. Right now, all of our flood sensor data is internally used for our public safety agencies, and during emergencies, it allows us to respond quickly to things. We would like to get to a point where all that data, and much of that data is now flowing to NOAA, and NOAA will be holding that data and creating a publicly facing interface, which is good to know too, because they have resources that are beyond anything that we have. So use those as much as you can. Look up Mesonet in your state and find out. I know I looked last night at Washington State's Mesonet system, which is run by Washington State University out of Pullman, and I could pull up microclimate data on soil, not just air temperature and precipitation, but like soil humidity and wind data for very localized areas, which is helpful. And then look at resources like I mentioned, Thriving Earth Exchange. That's the American Geophysical Union, AGU, has this group which basically allows local jurisdictions and nonprofits to apply for assistance from experts. And again, we have a professor emeritus from Ohio State University and an existing GIS professor from Michigan, and they are helping us on a voluntary basis on a project to try to incorporate, as I mentioned, the Landsat data from the Chesapeake Bay. That's 1 meter resolution, which is phenomenal. But it's also a lot of data, and it would be virtually impossible for us to kind of process that data without assistance from experts. So look at those opportunities to get some free help from people who are trying to do something for the greater good and are really happy to work on projects in other places around the country.
Thank you. That's really great information. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I have a question for Mara. Are insurance premiums beginning to reflect the risks of extreme heat for both health and property damage as they are with flooding and homeowners insurance?
Wow, that is an excellent question. I haven't heard that. I will say, I think I included a resource on the resources page, a link to FEMA's science. Now I'm going to forget the term, but they have a division that's been looking at alerting systems both on flooding and wildfires. And I know out west, that's like the big, a lot of big property risk. And I can tell you that my brother just told me last night that his insurance for his home increased fourfold because of fire risk, in spite of the fact that his particular property doesn't have trees right around it. And so there's a little bit of frustration sometimes in areas where these decisions are being made with maybe that 30-meter data about what's forested and what isn't. Whereas if you were able to drill down locally, you could see, hey, my property, I've done all of these different things. So the short answer is, I don't know. As it relates to heat specifically, I don't know the answer to that question, and what the impact is. In terms of homeowners insurance, I can't see that making a huge difference. I would almost, it's more about people's, health insurance and the health impacts for them. And certainly there's a lot of pressure. I know in the Pacific Northwest, places where they never thought they needed air conditioning, and they clearly do need to have it now. And that's an onerous expense for folks who can't afford it often. But I don't know the answer on the insurance and heat, but now I'm going to have to go back and think about it. We definitely see it with flooding, and I recognize we're in the process of doing a comprehensive flood management plan right now. And that is always a difficult tap dance that we do when we look at places that we know are in, a 100-year floodplain that's now maybe a 10-year floodplain, right? As those things are changing, and making that information public, and the pressure not to do that because of the implications on insurance. It's a really delicate line you have to walk. But it's also important that people know going in what the risk is. But it's interesting. It kind of speaks to the long-term impacts of things like redlining, because now you have communities where people are living that have elevated flood risk or fire risk, when that was the only place that those folks were able to purchase a home, and they've held it for years, and now trying to get out of it becomes almost impossible. I know we see that on the eastern shore of Maryland in places where families have lived, for generations, and you have both the rising sea levels and subduction happening there that make the insurance premiums really onerous. I don't know if you have any more insight into that, Kate. I'm not as familiar with kind of the heat and insurance question, but it's a good one.
No, not too much, but I really appreciate you bringing up the idea that there's a long legacy of intentional policy decisions that are going to reverberate, I think, for as long as our country lasts. And I think it's really important to, when we're taking a look at these hyper-local issues, to recognize that our communities don't look the way they do by accident, which means they're not going to change by accident. It means to be very intentional about that long-term harm reduction.
Oh, one tremendous book that I would also recommend, in addition to Kate's, which is fantastic, is a book called The Sum of Us. If anyone's familiar with that, it's about the kind of the impact on all of us about a lot of those policies, the racist policies, and how it has negatively impacted everyone. It was an eye-opening read for me, even looking at things like community pools. Living in where I do now, pools are a huge part of the community. Needless to say, growing up in Alaska, community pools was a bit of a foreign concept. We swam in cold lakes with leeches, but here it's a big deal. But so many of the private pools here were all developed right after desegregation of public pools. And I learned that there were areas in that book where, because of desegregation of public pools, it wasn't just that people built private pools, it was that they literally filled in the public pools with concrete in some places. So you have communities that don't have those community resources, and pools are one of the places we tell people to go during a heat emergency, to drop your core body temperature, get in cooler water, right? There are places where they don't have those pools because of those very intentional policies that had a negative impact on generations of people who don't even have an opportunity to learn how to swim, let alone cool themselves off. So
That's a really great point about pools. I think that's sort of gets to that simple interventions, but also the history of how access to resources and access to public services has been unequal in some places. We're getting close on time, so I'm going to ask one more question. Do you have any advice for those who are considering how to incorporate planning and common sense community resilience issues into K through 12 curriculums, and how do we involve the younger generation? We've talked a little bit about students and interns, but how do we reach the younger generations?
I'll start first because I feel like Kate should end it because she's more of an expert, having been a teacher. I will say schools are so important. We know in our area, for example, that schools are, for many communities, they are the one positive touch that families, especially immigrant families, have with government. The one source of information, often their kids are the filters, they're the source of the information that they get, comes through their children. So we have a lot of opportunities there. We are very fortunate that our school system here recently hired someone from Washington, D.C., who is implementing something he calls a Reach Hub, which is taking that idea of a resilience hub another step further, and they're building out an agricultural kind of hub with demonstration gardens and solar and rainwater recapture at one of our schools that happens to also be in a high needs area. They're going to be growing vegetables there, selling them locally to folks. And it's such an exciting project. And I think it goes to show that the enthusiasm. There were over 1,000 people showed up the day they broke ground on that. And the kids were so excited to be a part of this. So it is this opportunity where we have young people who are very concerned, very enthusiastic. And insofar as we can make it easier for them to have things like community gardens, I know in our jurisdiction, until recently, it has been a huge battle to have garden space in courtyards that were even pretty much barren or empty because there was a concern about pests. So there were it's important to try to engage in those conversations and look at other jurisdictions, look at what they're doing. Again, don't reinvent the wheel. There's so much good work being done. So look at what other jurisdictions are doing around that. And the one thing I'll just end on to, I wanted to say, because I think I forgot to say it earlier, but look at NOAA and look at FEMA for multilingual messaging too, and use those resources, because you don't need to translate everything yourself. But I'll stop.
Well, I used to be a middle school science teacher, and I have a young child myself. And a lot of the 1% solutions that I talk about, these small solutions that add up to a bigger impact, are really well suited for children. And I mentioned that in my book, Climate Action for Busy People. And I think that there's children come at this with a really unique element of criticality. If any of you spend time with young children, you know that there's a certain age range where they are very clear on like, this is right and this is wrong. And they're just starting to see shades of gray when they get into the middle school years. And this is a really great sense to kind of lean into their perspective on the world about, what would you change, and involve them as sort of fully formed human beings in a way, because they still have brain development to go through, but this is their future we're talking about. And I think there's a couple different ways to do that. Where I live in Somerville, Massachusetts, has, I think, adopted the nation's only K through 12 interdisciplinary climate curriculum, where across K through 12, all of the different teachers from, history to the reading teacher, et cetera, have some element to hold of a curriculum that takes children through their entire journey. So I encourage you folks to look that up. It's Somerville, Massachusetts, their interdisciplinary climate curriculum. I think there's also an opportunity to give kids a sense of empowerment by engaging them in some of these 1% solutions. I have a early elementary school age child, and walking around with her to do things like caring for our trees or clearing our storm drains gives her a sense of empowerment, gives her a sense that she has the ability to make changes in her community. And I think one of the biggest threats that we're facing around the climate crisis is a loss and a lack of hope. This sense that things can't change, or they won't change, or it's useless, and we should all sort of give in to this Mad Max dystopia future that we've kind of been promised in some ways. And so I think empowering young folks to see that things can change. I also, and I'll end with this because I know we are at time, is engaging them in community science. So doing things even like getting a really cheap from Home Depot, you can get it for like $15, a thermal gun, which you can point at the pavement outside the school, and you can point under a tree to show them that temperature difference. And that helps to get the messaging that, hey, this pavement's absorbing a lot of heat. Do we need as much of it as we do? Do we need that full driveway, or can we shorten it, or can we turn it into two concrete pads for the wheels and leave the rest as an absorbent or cooling space? Or even getting things like FLIR imagers. There are these little things that you can click onto your phone or iPad, and they take a thermal image so you can see the hotter and cooler parts visually. When we were working with residents in Pawtucket in Rhode Island, the kids have to go along a corridor that has no trees, and then stand next to a crosswalk to get across the street to their school that has a broken beg button. So what students did is they did their own community science project where they measured where the distance between the trees, where they were on the route, how long it took the light to change, and then presented that to the city's urban forester to say, hey, if we're going to be waiting out in the sun under this broken beg button, we should plant some trees here for some shade. So I think there's a lot of ways through community science and through various classes to get kids engaged in it. And I'll stop there. Really, really happy to be part of this and to get to share knowledge from my work and my book with you, and to be in conversation with you too, Mara.
Thanks, Kate. And I will say those community science things really work. Both my kids have done it. My daughter with the Urban Heat, my son with Frog Watch, and he's now studying to be a forester. So it
That's
gets them
great.
hooked.
Well, thank you both. This has been a wonderful conversation. It's definitely been informative and hopeful. So I appreciate you both and for taking the time to share your stories with us. I would like to offer my sincerest gratitude to Kate and Mara for joining us today and for sharing their important work. Thank you for everyone who attended. And as always, thank you, John Coleman, who has kept our webinar series running smoothly. A complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online. Only those here's my links mentioned in the presentation will be shared in the show notes to the best of our abilities when the recording is posted online. I just wanted to note that. And in addition, August is Climate Month, here at the Smart Growth webinar series. So look for additional offerings in the next 3 weeks that will feature some case studies and as well some technical assistance programs that are being successfully used in communities around the country. When you exit today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so we can continue to improve the webinar experience. Only those who indicated that they require a certificate during registration will receive one via email following the webinar. Please keep an eye on your inbox for details on future webinars sponsored by the Maryland Department of Planning and the Smart Growth Network. Thank you for joining us today and have a great day.